Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on what seemed like an impossible task to get together here on this recording, but we made it happen. I think it took a little bit of focus, a little bit of intrinsic optimism to get us where we needed to go, and a little bit of laughter so that we didn't get ourselves frustrated here. But I want to kick this off and say that the book which you wrote feels to me like a psychological playbook on how you can take yourself from this sort of self-limited state and move yourself into one that is quite close to unlimited, or what you would call, the superhuman, right? Or the Superman state. And when I think about the main blend of what you talked about and I have to look at these: oxytocin, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, endorphins, and anandamide, if I did that correct. Finding the right sort of balance between these can determine the level of focus you have on your internal goals and also externally those rewards which you're trying to achieve. Is that kind of close?
So you have to understand, for starters, when you get into neurochemistry itself, neurochemicals are multi-tools. So some of those chemicals, specifically norepinephrine and dopamine, are significantly involved in motivation. So when you talk about motivation, you're really predominantly talking about dopamine. Once other people get involved, so if you start talking about like purpose, right? And purpose is sort of what is it basically passion. You're taking your passion and directing it towards a problem that's outside in the world. The big deal with purpose is because other people are involved, we start getting what are known as pro-social neurochemicals. So that's when you start to see the other ones you mentioned: serotonin, endorphins, and oxytocin. Oxytocin, for example, really doesn't show up, as far as we can tell, without other people in the equation. It's predominantly, it's a trust chemical that shows up when other people are in the equation. And serotonin is a rest and relax chemical. When you eat a big meal and you calm down afterwards, that's serotonin. But it also makes us relax in social situations. So as you start getting, more pro-social situations, it'll start showing up, that sort of thing. You're on the right track, though, because from a practical, how can I enhance motivation in my life? You are sort of working with fundamental neurochemicals.
So then if we're dealing with the fundamentals, right? And like you said, before you get to the pro-social ones, we're looking at what's essentially happening on the internal track of my mind. So does my psyche and my thought process determine the first sort of step in me layering this stack that affords me the ability to get to this best possible state of thinking or focus that I would be in?
So that's an interesting question. No, actually. So, but I had to think about it. Dopamine will enhance. What dopamine does is it makes us excited. Like when dopamine's in our system, we're excited. We want to make meaning out of the world. We want to go exploring, right? Curiosity is really ramped up. And when you're curious about stuff, you sort of get focused for free. You don't have to work so hard to do it. Norepinephrine is similar but different. It's more like, if you've ever fallen in love and you can't stop thinking about the person you've fallen in love with, that sort of vigilante brain, that's norepinephrine. It'll lock you on to target. It's exciting, but if I give you too much norepinephrine, it moves from kind of like excitement into anxiety. So it's not a question of too much. And in fact, depending on kind of how you're hardwired, if you are dealing with ADHD, for example, a lot of the ADHD drugs, Ritalin and those things, are norepinephrine. There's speed, basically. You give it to somebody who doesn't have ADHD and it tightens focus. You give it to somebody who does and it calms them way down. And it does different things. So It's very much dependent on the person in a sense, but these are the kind of foundational neurochemicals that underlie motivation. And in the art of impossible, when I talk about motivation, by the way, we should just stop and
Define it.
point this out. When psychologists and neuroscientists really talk about motivation, we're talking about a stack of skills, right? There's extrinsic motivation. That's stuff in the world that you work really hard to get: money, sex, fame, new car, right? There's intrinsic motivation. These are internal drivers. We talked about curiosity. That's one of the more basic ones. The big five, there are obviously hundreds of internal motivators, but the big five are curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Then you're also talking about goal setting, and there actually are 3 different tiers of goal setting that we're sort of biologically hardwired for. And if you can get those right, and finally there's grit, and that's the full motivation stack. So when you're talking about how do you cultivate motivation, you're talking about aligning and tuning up that whole sort of stack of skills. And it's not super easy, but the benefits are extraordinary. And the thing is, you said earlier, this sort of the book, I don't think as the Art of Impossible is a guide to like how to unlock your Superman self, because it gets past kind of the first basic point I wanted to make in that book, which is all human beings are foundationally hardwired for peak performance. It comes built in.
Correct.
For starters, we can all get into flow, right? And flow is a state of optimal performance where we feel our best and perform our best. And when we're in flow, all aspects of performance, it's a long list of what gets amplified, tend to go through the roof. That's available to everyone. This other sides of the system, the motivational skill set we talked about, there's a bunch of learning skills and there's a bunch of creativity skills. Those go along with the flow skills. We can talk about what those are, but that's essentially the skill set that we call peak performance. That's all we're talking about: motivation, learning, creativity, and flow. And everybody comes with those abilities built in as well. In fact, in 30 years of kind of studying peak performance and really spending my time kind of, investigating how everybody can do this, the thing that's most overwhelming to me is that like we are all basically hardwired to tackle hard challenges. We're all hardwired for peak performance. That's the lesson you see over and over and over again. And in fact, I like to say that, I've spent a lot of time around extraordinary people, the people who've done so-called impossible feats in all domains. And none of them started out extraordinary, right? They just figured out how to get their biology to work for them rather than against them, and did that over a long period of years. That's what you tend to see.
So this is made abundantly clear now. We all come predisposed to having these traits in us. Unlocking them, turning them on, or getting out of our own way is really a function of our choice for how we want to look at the world. And we can use the biology to our benefit, correct? The one that just innately sits within us.
For sure, absolutely.
So is our psyche then the internal trigger that has to make that decision first for choosing the goal, finding the one to learn?
The problem, I don't know what you mean by our psyche. That word doesn't mean anything to me in psychological terms, unless we're going back to Freud. So I'm getting lost in your question.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so my train of thought is that, so when I perceive the world and I have a specific train of thought, whether this be some high hard goal in HHG or anything else, whatever that motivation might be, does that have to happen first before I can start to work on this sort of stack that gets me into these innate traits that I come with?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a cool question. Let's.
Oh, now it's cool. Now I changed the word. Okay.
Now I know what you're asking. That's a cool question. All right. So, and it gets at a really cool point, which is, what is at the heart of the Art of Impossible is sort of what we've learned over the past 5 to 10 years studying that. I'm not talking about me or even my organization, the Flow Research Collective, I mean we, the field of science, right? Neuroscience, everybody looking at peak performance. What everybody working together has sort of figured out over the past 15 years is all these individual pieces of the puzzle that we've all heard about for years and read books on, whether it's focus or mindfulness or flow or grit or goal setting. Like we've all heard the little parts of the whole thing, accelerated learning and blah, 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 right? There's lots of great books on those individual pieces. I've written some of those books, right?
Yeah.
Not great ones, but I've written a couple of those books. And what we learned, what has been figured out over the past 5 years is, wait a minute, our biology is a system. It evolved in a certain order to work a certain way. And the way I explained those 4 skill sets we mentioned earlier that sort of encompass all this, motivation is what you need to get into the game. Learning allows you to continue to play. Creativity is how you steer. And flow is how you turbo boost the results beyond all reasonable expectations. So that's the quick shorthand to think about that stack. Here's what we've learned in the past 5 years is, because it's designed to come online in a specific order and work in a certain way, it's not that you can't start training flow before your motivation stack is online or learning.
Right.
You can do it whichever way. You'll get results. The big deal is if you do it in the order that it was designed to work in and use the system the way it was designed to work, you're just going to get a lot farther, a lot faster with a lot less fuss. And that's the really big deal. And do it using the system. And let me give you some simple examples. The way the system was designed to work, you want to start cultivating motivational skills. And once you do that, because of how the motivational skills need to be cultivated, that's going to start triggering flow. Once you start getting flow, which among its extraordinary performance benefits, it feels extraordinarily good. That's one of the core components. It's a euphoric state. Scientists talk about it. One of its core characteristics is being autotelic. That's a fancy way of saying an end in itself, right? It basically means all those 5 pleasure chemicals we talked about earlier, they all show up in flow, right? It's the most addictive, pleasurable state on earth. When we test people, people will prefer flow to pretty much any other experience. And it really matters because we now know from a positive psych standpoint that the people who score off the charts for overall life satisfaction and well-being, these are the people with the most flow in their lives. So there's a specific, direct, link between how much flow you get, how happy you are, how much your life means to you, and how much life satisfaction you feel. Very super motivating. That's the result of all those feel-good neurochemicals, right? Here's the thing. If you start trying to train grit before you're producing a lot of flow, you're going to be miserable, because the only way to train grit is to, let's say you're working out, right? You want to learn how to get gritty in the gym. If your normal workout is 3 sets of 8 reps, well, today it's got to be 2 sets of 8 reps, 1 set of 9, right? And just slowly over time. Grit is really trainable, but you actually have to train it by pushing yourself slightly harder than you want to go, slightly harder than you think you can go, day after day after day for a really long time. Grit without flow is a recipe for burnout. That is one of the ways we burn ourselves out. This reason the system was designed to work in a certain order is so you're going to start getting some flow from an activity before you have to start really learning how to get gritty in that activity. So that's what I mean. You won't have to work as hard to develop the skills you want to develop. That's why you want to think about it in an order, in a specific way. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And, I can even use it on my personal example. I did a lot of collegiate rowing, and I'm not going to be shy about it. I was pretty good at it. But what I found is that it felt more of this repetitive stress job where I was great at the flow, when I'm actually in that state of doing it. I could do the grit, I could push myself harder, but it lacked total motivation. The focus in my development actually did burn me out, so much that I actually never want to be in a rowboat probably ever again.
So here's another one. We talk about, so we're going to, let me just talk a little bit more about flow. I need some backup, but when we
settle down now, it's all good. We're getting there.
I was trying to figure out how to get this. So what I wanted to tell you is, because you drilled it on focus, autonomy is a foundational motivators, one of the big 5 intrinsic motivators, right? This is
Right.
obvious to all of us. When you get to choose what to do, you care a hell of a lot more about it. But there's a neurobiological cost for not having autonomy. Autonomy and attention are literally coupled systems in the brain. They overlay one another. So you literally, if you're not doing something of your own, of your choosing, you cannot focus completely on it. And
Right.
as a result, by the way, you're probably going to get blocked from flow on a regular basis with it, which is going to make it even harder, right? And once again, recipe for burnout. So autonomy as a motivator is super important. In fact, I always tell people, one of the only ways to get around it is to use mastery. So if you have to do something that's not by your own choosing, boss gives you a job, says you got to do this. The company's future depends on it, and you really don't want to do it. The best way forward is to find something in the job that affords, in the task that affords you an opportunity for mastery. Oh, here's I mean, the whole job sucks, but here's a little skill that actually matters to me, and I'm going to get better at it, right? And you reframe it so you can get that autonomy and that little bit of mastery. It's a really potent tool, and without it, it's really hard to kind of master attention.
Yeah. No, and I get that. And I remember like my life at that. I'm just using myself as an
That's all
example
right.
because that's what I know. You know, my life became a function of how low can you get a specific number over a set distance. That was the mastery, right? How do I get there? How do I get there the most efficiently? Everything else, it paid for me to go to university at the time, and all that other good stuff. But it wasn't truly something I had any passion towards. I wasn't actually intrinsically motivated to do this thing. And what I found is that when I chose to leave rowing, there felt like some sort of internal autonomy. Like I now had free will over the decision for where my life was going to head. And it made a massive difference in my internal happiness, but it also afforded me the focus to go do things I really wanted to do. And, until reading what, you had said, I didn't realize that it was a combination of these efforts and one had to lead before the other to really know that this process,
Well,
it's almost like
yeah,
go ahead.
you had to get free of the old shackles so you could, right? If curiosity is the foundational motivator, you want to end up cultivating passion or purpose, or right, you want to start with curiosity because it's the most basic kind of human motivator. It's a little bit of norepinephrine, a little bit of dopamine, and
Yeah.
curiosity, that's what builds into passion. Right? If you were locked into this, that was the first thing I heard in your voice is, oh yeah, I walked away from rowing and suddenly I was free to pursue things that I was interested in. I would guess what I heard in your voice, I could be making it up, is that like you didn't even know you were interested in this stuff until you walked away from rowing.
Precisely correct. Yeah, right. I just knew I knew I was disinterested in rowing.
And yeah,
yeah,
it's a funny thing because if you're not getting sort of, the other thing that you're not getting in that situation is you're not getting the dopamine reward from you, right? If you're not interested in the goal, right? If you beating a time is really not your thing, and it's not a lot of people's things, right? Yeah. My problem with competitive sports in general is I was like, you think it matters if like I beat the other guy? Like who the fuck cares?
Yeah, no, that's my point. Yeah.
Right? Like I wanted to beat myself. Like that's why I like action sports, because you have to beat yourself. But like beating somebody, like it seems very important to them to win. So okay, they can win. I don't care. Like really? Like I can't believe that there's any version of myself that is better if I can row slightly faster than you across the lake. Like I just
right.
Yeah, I'm willing to believe there's a much better version of myself if I go out and ski a gnarly big line in Alaska. Right. I think the guy who comes out the other end is different than the guy who started. And that's a challenge I'm interested in. Other people are like, look, the version of me that can win this rowing race is a better version, right? Like it's just how you're wired, I think. It's one of the reasons you have to get your intrinsic motivators lined up, because ultimately what your goals are, they're silly. You're just proving yourself to yourself over and over again, right? Because you want to feel safe and secure in this world, and you think if I can prove myself to myself today, maybe I'm a little safer and more secure than I was yesterday. And it all takes place at a subconscious level. But like, this is what we're doing. And I mean, I can tell you how to do it better, but it's still kind of silly.
it's like some weird perverse narrative I was living. And I felt like I thought I was in reality, but in truth, there was no reality to what I was doing. I wasn't actually being the human I wanted to be. And so if I go out and I want to look for sort of that social oxytocin that comes from these other inputs from people in these other groups, I could never truly enjoy that unless I found the enjoyment internally within myself, with what I'm doing, with what my own nature is. But I know that motivation is such a hard thing for so many people, Stephen. And when I think about that, is how do we even get people to the line of motivation? So many are non-motivated. How do we even get the non-starters to move?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I can tell you what the research
I'd
shows.
love to know, please. Yeah.
I mean, the research says, look, if you're cultivating motivation, the place you have to start is extrinsic motivation. You need to make enough money to pay your bills and have a little left over for fun, basically. Basically, it's because if there's too much fear in the system, meaning like, where's my rent coming from? I can't feed my family. I've got food insecurity, those kinds of things. It produces way too much fear. But once you sort of solve that crisis, what people don't realize is if you want to get motivated or you want more forward progress, extrinsic motivators are no longer going to get it done. Like that's when you want to start reaching for intrinsic motivators. And you really just want to start with curiosity. And curiosity is, when I talk about starting with curiosity, I mean just like, what you're looking to do is build more passion into your life, right? And the way to do that is, passion is quite simply nothing fancier than the intersection of like 3 or 4 or 5 of your curiosities. And so, right, a single curiosity, when I say like explore your curiosities, I mean like if I could pause time and I gave you 2 free days and I could say, you can learn anything you want, go read a couple books, watch a movie, attend a lecture, maybe take a quick class. That's all I mean by curiosity. Like if you had a free weekend, you'd want to spend it learning this, right? Start cultivating those kinds of curiosities and really start looking for where they overlap and intersect. That's how you start, and you play at those overlaps and those intersections. It's how you start to cultivate passion. The way to think about it is, one curiosity, it's not strong enough to be passion, right? It won't sustain you for the long haul, but you find where 2 or 3 or 4 of those curiosities meet, meaning 3 or 4 of those things that produce a lot of dopamine naturally and give you a lot of focus. Now you're starting to really cook. You're starting to get a lot of focus for free. That's sort of the aim. And where people screw up is I think what demotivates people is they have a mistaken assumption about passion. Like if I say, hey, talk to me about athletic passion. And, people tell me stories about like LeBron James and the playoffs, right? And windmilling in for some thunder dunk with that crazy grit expression on his face, right? That's what we think about. And what people forget is that's passion on the back end. That's what it looks like when it's already fully mature. So they are starting to like, why don't I feel that in myself? Oh, I don't have that. You forget that passion on the front end is nothing more than a little kid in a driveway shooting baskets, hoping the ball's going to fall, going, oh, what happens if I spin it this way or this way, and just exploring basic curiosities. That's what it looks like on the front end. So one of the reasons I think people get really derailed on this is they want to get there yesterday, and they expect way too much from themselves way too soon. And you can't go into this kind of quest looking for fireworks. They show up, but they're slow to build. I always say with peak performance, everything works like compound interest. It's a tiny little bit today, plus a tiny little bit tomorrow, and the really big impacts that everybody's looking for, they're almost guaranteed because of how the biology works, but it also works slowly. It's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, evolution's a slow process. I mean, if it would have been quick, we'd all be hairless and probably not speaking and super intelligent, but it takes time. It takes a lot of mistakes.
Hairless?
Yeah, hair.
Is super intelligent. This is you okay.
If I think about that,
more about you than about anything evolutionary. But that's interesting. Okay.
I just think, listen, all right, listen. If I wanted to use you as an example for childlike curiosity, where did it start for you then, Stephen? I know that you wanted to do, the book talks about you doing research, asking questions,
this particular one, I sort of won. I won the weird lottery. So,
tell me.
when I was my parents had me. They were pretty young. They didn't have a ton of money, and I don't think my mother really knew how to be a mom. Right? She was in her early 20s. There was no money. But she knew that books were good. So we would just go to the library, and anything that was interesting to me, she would just take a book out, and we would go home, and all she would do is read to me until I started reading, and then I would read to her. And so early on, I had a mom who didn't really know what she was doing and made up for that by reading everything, and it totally worked. And my parents were, it's funny because we battled through my childhood. I was a punk rock kid, and I was difficult.
You look like a punk. You look like a punk. I can tell you that.
I was a difficult, rowdy, challenging child. But my parents, to their credit, if I was curious about something, even if we didn't have any money, they would find a way. Right? I was curious about dinosaurs. Oh, it turns out there's free classes every Saturday at the Natural History Museum, and they would drive me, which was, incredibly cool. The realization that I probably wouldn't do that for another human being is one of the reasons I don't have children. I ski on my Saturdays, man, or I'm going surfing. I don't know.
Why are you so damn selfish? What's going on here? Oh, man. Okay, so your lottery was really the fact that you had all these external catalysts that really continued to feed your childlike curiosity. And what's interesting about that stage,
it just never went away. And I became a journalist, right? And journalism is essentially getting paid to be curious. And it comes, because I was working predominantly, I was working a lot in science journalism, and this was sort of back in the 90s when I know this is a really strange concept now, but magazines and newspapers, they had these things called fact checkers. So it was important to them that the thing I said was true was actually true. Mm-hmm. I know it's bizarre.
What a strange concept.
I know it's a really hard concept. So I hope I spoke it slowly enough. Anyways, they were vicious. The people who were fact checkers, I always thought they must have been the failed writers who were really pissed about it, because they would go out of their way to try to prove me wrong. Which, when you're trying, and when you're writing, and for good reason, right? I do a science story for the New York Times magazine, and it's about some weird thing in neuroscience or genetics. I may be the only opinion that the reader's ever going to have on that bit of science. So there's a reason they were so vicious, and I really appreciated it. But what it meant is I had to learn this stuff at a kind of an expert level to write about it. And so once your curiosity starts leading into actual mastery, right? Even just the shores of mastery, I think it took 20 or 30 years before I, ever kind of achieved the kind of mastery in science that I really wanted. But that, as you know, is a super fun drug.
No, listen, I get that from talking to people. I enjoy so much listening and trying to understand your thought processes and what you want to share. You're like that book that's right in front. I don't have to turn pages. I can just ask questions and you can just brain dump all day.
Understand that that was essentially what journalism allowed, right? We didn't have podcasters. So if you wanted to go out and talk to the smartest people in the world, at the time, journalists were really the only people who got to do it. I had an editor, Rob Hill, who used to say, "Nobody knows, but we get to walk through the kingdom." And I was
cool.
And I was now it's a slightly different thing, because you can there's an internet, you can find experts, you can do all that sort of stuff. But and I will tell you that when you can call up and say, hey, this is Stephen Kotler with the New York Times, like people will tell you anything, right? You could call, but you pay the price. I would not routinely, but I've been screamed at called an idiot many times by really like top minds. I have a tape recording. I don't have it anymore because I don't have a tape recorder anymore, but I used to have a tape recording of a Nobel Prize winning scientist yelling at me for 40 minutes. I didn't understand a thing he said. Like I literally called him up. I said, hi, this is Stephen Kotler, blah, blah, blah. I asked a single question and he just started screaming, and he screamed for like 40 minutes and then he hung up, and I was like, what? Right. I went back to my question and I realized there was like this hidden presupposition in my question that I didn't even notice.
Really?
He thought it undercut everything he had devoted his entire life to. And I'd actually really insulted him, but I had no idea. It took so long to figure that out. True story.
I love it. I love it when like the ego will just completely take something and just bring it off the walls. And you're just like, oh, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here. And you ask a question and people derail.
It was one of those questions where you're like, in blah, blah, blah article, you wrote blah, blah, blah. So this way, right? And like, I didn't even think about the first half of the sentence, right? That was the like setup. Let me just get to my first question. So live and learn.
Wow. Okay. And so, all right, then I got to round this back then. The curiosity, the journalism, all these things. You told the story about surfing, and I know you like to surf and I like to ski, right? You said there was a point when you felt like your frame of reference had actually left the material self and you were skiing. And I know you talk about, meditation in a short sense. Can you just talk to me about that real quick? I want to hear from your mouth what that experience was like.
So you're talking about this. So you're talking about the story. You basically a surfing triggered flow state.
Yeah. So you were sick.
You want to? Oh, okay. So do you want me to tell that story, or what do you ask? I would ask why that epiphenomenon.
Well, hold on. All right. I need you to tell the story so people understand it, and then let's talk about
what's going on. Okay, so I'm gonna back up and start a few years before this story, just to give people context. I said I became a journalist in the early 1990s. Two things fascinated me: neuroscience. It wasn't even neuroscience. I wanted to know how people worked. Right? I want to know how I worked. I want to know how other people work. And neuroscience in the 90s. There was a field that was just starting to emerge called behavioral neuroscience, like literally the neurobiology of how people worked. And the big deal here, the reason neuroscience matters, the reason you should care, is psychology, however useful, is essentially metaphorical. If neuroscience is mechanism. So if you want to know how stuff really works, you really want to sort of understand the neuroscience. And we were starting to get the first picture of this is how behavior works. Simultaneously, I was hanging out and covering a lot of stories in action sports, surfing, skiing, rock climbing, snowboarding, and the like. And if you know anything about action sports in the 1990s, there was it's the era of impossible, where more impossible feats, things that had never been done before, they were supposed to never be done. They weren't just being done, they were being iterated on. And this really caught my attention, right? And this was how this was happening. And could I actually use the neuroscience I was learning about writing these science articles to kind of decode what was happening in athletics? Became sort of a mission for me. And so I was looking at that very, very seriously and had been doing that for a while. And then around age 30, as you pointed out, I got Lyme disease, and it was sort of the end of my career. I spent 3 years in bed. I was incredibly sick. If you don't know what Lyme is like, it's sort of like the worst flu you've ever had, crossed with paranoid schizophrenia. That's not a joke. Paranoid schizophrenia is the most common misdiagnosis for Lyme. So everything neurobiological or neurological in me was gone. I had no short-term memory, no long-term memory. I was hallucinating. I couldn't see straight. I had pain everywhere. I was so sick I could barely walk across the room. And after 3 years of this, the doctors pulled me off meds. They never knew if I was going to get any better. My stomach lining started bleeding out in reaction to the meds. And
This was high dose antibiotics, I'm guessing,
Yeah,
because that's all they could do with Lyme
this
disease
was
at the
before
time.
this was before somebody pointed out that it was a bad idea to keep somebody on doxycycline for a year and a half, right?
Yeah, I'd say.
It was like totally.
Stephen, don't go out in the sun, Stephen.
Right. Anyways, needless to say, I was functional about 10% of the time. So I could work like an hour a day, and the rest of the time I would lie on a couch and moan. And I knew it was like, fuck, from here on out, I'm a burden to my friends, to my family. Like, I may never get any better. And I was getting very suicidal, not even out of depression, just out of practicality. Like, there was no way to live my life. And I really, like, I didn't want other people to have to take care of me for the rest of my life. And in the middle of this really dark period, a friend of mine showed up my door. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and she demands we go surfing. And I just started laughing. I was like, I can't walk across a room. You're out of your mind. And it had also been like 4 or 5 years since I had surfed. And she wouldn't leave and wouldn't leave and kept badgering me. And then, hours went by. And finally I was like, you know what? Anything to get her to shut up. Like, let's just go surfing today. I mean, what the hell? I can always kill myself tomorrow. Right? I mean, like, what is the worst that could happen? So they literally, her and a friend had to carry me to the car because I couldn't really walk to the car. Then they had to carry me to the beach. They gave me a board the size of a Cadillac. And it was Sunset Beach in Los Angeles, which, if you know anything about surfing, that is literally the wimpiest beginner wave in the world. And the tide was out. So the waves were like 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet tall, 3 feet at best. And no one was out on the lineup, which is really rare in Los Angeles. And they literally carried me out to the lineup. We walked me out to the lineup, put me on a board, and I sat down, and that first wave came like 30 seconds later, and I don't know what happened. I lost my goddamn mind, and I took all the energy I had left in the world, I think, and decided I was going to try to catch that wave. And it was maybe like, as I said, like 1.5 feet high, but I paddled and popped my feet and popped up into a dimension that I didn't even know existed.
Okay.
And I suddenly felt like I had panoramic vision, like I could see outside of my back of my head. Time had slowed down. I was moving in an absolute crawl. I had this weird out of body experience going on. But the strangest part, forget all the like weird stuff, I felt great. I mean, I felt amazing. My head was clear. There was no pain in my body. I felt so good. I caught 4 more waves that day. And after those 5 waves, I was totally disassembled. There was nothing left of me. They took me home, they poured me into bed, and I couldn't move for about 2 weeks. And then on like the 15th day, when I could move again, I went back to the ocean because I wanted more. I caught a ride with a friend, and I wanted this same experience. And once again, I had this weird altered state experience, and same thing. And over the course of about 8 months, when the only thing I was doing different in my life was surfing and having these really weird altered state experiences, 2 things happened that really caught my attention. One is I got better. I went from 10% functional up to about 80% functional. And that didn't make any sense because surfing is not a known cure for chronic autoimmune conditions. So what the hell is going on?
Correct.
But I kept having these very powerful altered state experiences while surfing. And Lyme is only fatal if it gets in your brain.
Correct.
I'm a science writer. I'm a rational materialist. I figured even though I was feeling better, the disease must be in my brain, and I was dying. And I lit out on a quest. What the hell is wrong with me? And I quickly figured out that these altered states of consciousness had names. They were flow states. And they were really similar, actually, in description of what the athletes said they were been tapping into to kind of achieve the impossible back in the 90s. And it hadn't made a whole lot of sense to me because some of the language had been mystical and weird. And suddenly I was having a lot of these experiences. I was like, oh, wow. When I figured out they were flow states, I got remarkably lucky in that the moment I went looking, a guy named Herb Benson had written a book called The Breakout Principle, where he mapped kind of the neurobiology of flow. And he pointed out that as we move into the state, there's a global release of a nitric oxide. It's a gaseous signaling molecule. It's all over the body.
Right.
It pushes stress hormones out of our system, and it lets all those feel-good, performance-enhancing neurochemicals, dopamine, serotonin, they flood in. And what he pointed out is 2 things. One, this explained what happened to me, because a autoimmune condition is a nervous system gone haywire. It doesn't know where normal is. It can't. The body is a homeostatic organism, but if it can't find baseline, it doesn't know where to go. So you bounce all over the place. That's essentially
Protects itself, right?
by resetting my nervous system to 0, suddenly I was like giving it, like the organ, it was resetting. But more importantly, those same neurochemicals all are huge immune system boosters. And Herb Benson in the Breakout Principle went so far as to say, hey, I think most of the cases of so-called spontaneous healing we see, it's this mechanism. But what I started to figure out is, oh, wait a minute, the same state of consciousness that took me from seriously subpar to normal, it was helping all those same athletes go from normal all the way up to Superman. And that was sort of my introduction into flow. And from that point on, I mean, I wrote a bunch of hundreds of articles. I wrote for Psychology Today. I wrote 7 books. I started the Flow Research Collective get to work with 50 different neuroscientists and psychologists. And now, and folks at USC and Stanford and UCLA. And, it's the same quest. What the hell is going on? And how does it work? And can we use it for our benefit?
I find this incredibly interesting as a data point, specifically about you, and how this moves into a lot of other things. You are on the board, and you made a choice that I am going to appropriate my energy and focus to this one wave. In doing so, and if I think you describe it properly, if I can describe this properly, the parietal lobe goes quiet.
Oh, so you want to talk about? You want to talk about oneness with everything? That's the question.
I love how you jumped the gun, but Stephen, people gotta get there.
You asked that question. You asked where'd the mystical stuff come from, and I told you the whole story, and I left out the ending. Okay, so the mystical stuff is really common, by the way, for the first 50 years when scientists were looking at flow. Until Abraham Maslow came along, it was predominantly a discussion about people in spiritual and religious communities. They thought it was a religious experience that people could have, but they didn't think it was common for all people. And then Abraham Maslow in the 50s was studying a group of super high achievers, super successful people. He wanted to know what was their secret, and the only commonality he found is they had all found ways to alter consciousness and put themselves into flow states, and that was part of the secret to their success. So suddenly, peak experiences, mystical experiences throughout, flow states came next. And what we have started to figure out, and this is sort of what happened to me, because when I was out in the waves, I didn't know what the hell was happening, but one of the things I knew is that I was feeling one with the ocean, right? I had this sensation of merging with the ocean. My consciousness was expanding. They call it oceanic boundlessness, literally in the psychological literature. That was the technical term for it. And in religious traditions, they talk about it as oneness with everything. And so it had showed up a lot. It wasn't just me. I remember Laird Hamilton, the first time I interviewed him, the big wave surfer.
Big wave surfing. Yeah.
He would talk about this experience, and other surfers would mention it. And I was like, I didn't quite get what was going on. But right at the time I was asking these questions, a guy who would become my mentor, Dr. Andrew Newberg, he was at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a neuroscientist. He was the very first neuroscientist to use brain scans. He was using SPEC, which was like early fMRI with a radioactive tracer, to look in the brains of Franciscan nuns and Tibetan Buddhists who both experienced oneness with everything. For the
as they pray and meditate, right?
They pray and meditate. So with the nuns, it's unia mystica, it's oneness with Jesus' love, and for the Buddhists, it's absolute unitary being, oneness with the universe. And so he took pictures of their brains, trying to figure out what was going on, and what he discovered.
Oh, you still there? You cut out.
Here, you froze.
Oh no, I was watching you, and you just froze, disappeared. So we have a full post-production team. So keep going, keep talking. I caught the part of the nuns and the Buddhists with the oneness, and then Andrew Newberg.
What's going on? What he figured out is, so your brain is an energy hog, right? The brain, like your brain, just like uses 25% of the body's energy at rest. So like 1/4 of everything you eat goes to power your brain, right? And yet it's like a tiny, tiny fraction of your actual body weight. So the first order of business for all structures in the brain is conserve energy. So when you're really focused, like in Buddhist meditation or Franciscan prayer on a single thing, the brain goes, oh, you need lots of energy for focus and attention, and it shuts down non-critical structures. One of the structures that gets shut down is sort of near the intersection of the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. It's called the temporal parietal junction, and sort of more in the right parietal lobe and the TPJ, but right in that area, this portion of the brain shuts down, stops sending information out, stops taking information in. What does the right TPJ do? It, among other things, it helps us orient ourselves in space. It essentially draws a line around the body and says, you end here and the rest of the world begins. And in flow, in deep meditative trance states, when this part of the brain shuts down, you lose the ability to say, hey, I end here and the rest of the world begins. So people who've had a stroke or brain damage to this area, they can't even sit down on a couch because they're like, well, where does my leg end and where does the couch begin? When it shuts off in meditation or in flow, what happens is the same thing. Your brain goes, at this point, we can't tell where you end and the rest of the world begins to concludes. It has to conclude that at this particular moment, you are one with everything.
And that's sort of that ecstatic meditation. Those are those states that people would want to be in all the time, as opposed to other extrinsic motivators, right? They'll go for this sort of intrinsic thing that is occurring that makes them feel this expansiveness. I mean, for you, for your flow state, surfing, putting you into the state multiple times brought you from 10% usefulness as a human being back up to 80% for yourself, right? So when I think about practicality of tools and for people getting to those things, is this something that people should practice if the data points say that you can move yourself to these states that actually give you a more articulated focus, allowing you to practice that focus? Is this something that in common people should try and do?
Well, are you asking me if people should try to get into flow?
No. I'm asking if they should use meditation as a tool to feel those flow states. If they can't find themselves motivated, should they use meditation as a way to even get there?
So you can use meditation as a way to train the brain for focus. That enhanced focus tends to help people drop into flow. Flow is a focusing skill. It's like mindfulness is a focusing skill, but they're different. So slightly different things are happening in the brain. They're similar, but different. But mindfulness, this is a really well-established finding at this point. People with a regular mindfulness practice will end up with more flow. So that's a very useful tool. And as far as, tapping into, more of these altered states of consciousness, to me, the benefits for flow are the performance enhancement is enormous. And they're deeply meaningful experiences, right? So you get enormous, motivation and productivity and flow will go up sometimes 500% above baseline. We'll see creativity and innovation spike 400 to 700%. The Department of Defense figured out that soldiers in flow learn 240 to 500% faster than normal. So, and so forth. And so, right, this is huge spikes in a lot of core performance metrics, which is why, I think flow has become a tool in business and in the regular world. But on the more spiritual side, I don't know. It's the only spiritual experiences if you want to call those spiritual experiences, they're the only ones I ever get. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I have never meditated myself into a spiritual experience, but I've certainly skied myself and surfed myself. You know what I think certain tools work better for certain people than others on that particular one.
Okay, yeah, no, I was just asking because people all over the world listen to this. Some of them are Buddhists, some of them may be a practicing nun, but if flow is that common state, outside of any sort of religion or dogma, whatever it might be, getting people to move above Maslow's basal needs, get rid of those fears, and using tools that help them focus on things that can really advance their evolution biologically or within their social groups or how they even feel mentally, like those are data points that I want to share with them so that they can help better understand themselves. And once they understand themselves, they can understand the rest of the world, right? You didn't have time really to focus on anyone else. And you said, if I'm continually in the state of sickness, of, having Lyme's disease and having it affect my immune system, well, then I'm frankly more of a burden, and people feel like a burden. There's a great majority of it. And so when I look at this and when I read about flow states and the chemicals, it is uplifting to hear that at a fundamental level, everybody carries these innate traits, and just finding practical ways for them to go about it and begin to unlock those levels of potential that they have within them is something very, very positive. And I just love the fact that your new book on the impossible shares that for them to adopt. If that makes any sense.
Sure. Thank you.
And so, yeah, listen, you're the one that wrote the book, and that's got to require a huge amount of flow, because the focus and just putting together a narrative that makes sense is not an easy task. And you've done it 7 times, so I guess in some way it's got to be like skiing for you. Otherwise, that just seems like quite an impossible feat.
Well, my first book took 11 years.
That's insane.
My second one took 6. My third one took 3. Then I started to get good at 4 through 14 as a general rule, a year to 2. Right? So it took me 3 or 4 books to warm up, but I'm finishing book 14 right now. And anything's easy with 20 years practice, 30 years practice.
That's the compound interest for you, I guess, right?
It is the compound interest. Also, writing is fully aligned with all my intrinsic motivators, right? Curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, mastery produces a lot of flow for me. So, that helps tremendously.
No, I think that's phenomenal. And then if
the thing I want to say is, because we didn't really cover this, and I know I have to jump in 3 or 4 minutes, but it's not about mindfulness or not. We now know that flow states have triggers, right? That's the big deal. Preconditions that lead to more flow. And so if you want more flow in your life, these triggers are your toolkit. There's 22 of them. And they all basically work the same way. We've been talking about it all show, right? Flow follows focus. Shows up when all of our attention is in the right here, right now. That's what these flow triggers do. They drive attention into the present moment, right? And they do it either by pushing dopamine and norepinephrine into our system or some combination, or they lower cognitive load. Cognitive load is all the crap you're trying to think about at any one time. And if I lower it, I liberate more energy for attention and gets repurposed on the task at hand. So those triggers are available to anybody. They're all built in, right? They work automatically. Novelty, for example, is a flow trigger. And we know this. You travel, you drop into flow states all the time. Why? Because you're in novel environments and it's dropping a lot of dopamine into your system and it's driving that focus. And people don't realize that's automatic. So I'll give you an example of how I use that in my own life. I have to read a bunch of neuroscience textbooks in my daily life, right? Here's Cognitive Neuroscience of Attention, Volume 2. This is this week's fare. And as you might imagine, Cognitive Neuroscience of Attention, Volume 2, and all this other stuff, these books are thrilling. They're the most exciting things you've ever read.
I don't doubt that.
You can't put them down. I know. So they're hard reading, right? And ideally, I want to be in flow if I can read them, because I don't want to have to read them twice. I want accelerated learning. I want to get it the first time, right? When I'm really sort of slogging through something that's difficult, first thing I do is take it on the road. Take my book to a coffee shop around across town where I haven't been before, because I'm in a novel environment.
Oh, interesting.
The novelty in the environment is putting a little bit of dopamine into my system. Or I'll give you I'll take it one step further. When I just did this, I usually do this twice a year. When I really have a bunch of textbooks, when I'm trying to solve a puzzle and I've got a bunch of books that I have to read, I will rent a hotel room with a balcony that looks out onto like a huge natural vista. And I will go there, I'll sit in the balcony and I'll read there, because you get the novelty, but you also get other flow triggers like unpredictability and complexity from the environment. And it starts to add up and it starts to produce a little flow. And then one of the other flow triggers that we talk a lot about is pattern recognition, linking ideas together, right? We've all had this experience. You go crossword puzzle or Sudoku, you get an answer right, that little rush of pleasure, that's dopamine. And one of the cool things about dopamine and norepinephrine too is, besides driving focus, they also enhance signal to noise ratios. They basically make you detect more patterns. So if you've ever noticed, you get an answer right in a crossword puzzle, you don't just get one, you get like 2 or 3 in a row. It's because the dopamine you get from the first right answer, now you're noticing more connections between ideas. And so this is why creative ideas spiral. It's why one will lead to the next and lead to the next and lead to the next. So that's going to happen. I start reading this novel environment. I got a little bit of dopamine in my system. So I'm a little more focused. I'm a little more able to spot patterns. Suddenly something reminds me of a bit of other research that I've read, and boom, connection, a little more dopamine. And so suddenly, just by taking my shit on the road and using a new environment to sort of trigger a little bit of dopamine, I have a much easier time getting into flow, and thus can focus for 479 pages of the most exciting book you've ever read. I mean, like the Da Vinci Code, forget about it. Cognitive Neuroscience of Attention, Volume 2. Thank you, Michael Posner.
So I guess the mic drop is take your shit on the road. And if you want to really put some focus into something.
I think the mic drop is, you could go to flowresearchcollective.com, go to the video page. There's tons of free videos about the flow triggers and everything else, or you can buy The Art of Impossible, but just learn how to work with flow. It's built in, comes hardwired into all of us. If you're interested in exploring spiritual paths, this is, the neuroscience is roughly the same. If you're interested in peak performance, it's, there's a lot to offer, and it's built in.
That's awesome. Well, Stephen, you gave me a shitload of time today, and I'm definitely more knowledgeable than I was about 45 minutes ago. So I appreciate you sharing that. And this is going to have a lot of reach.
Enjoy
a lot of people.
If you happen to bump into Bigfoot, send him my love.
I will. Well, listen, Stephen, thank you so much.
We always assume Bigfoot is male.
I just go with it. Bigfoot, who knows? You never know. But listen, thank you so much for coming on, Stephen. I really do appreciate it. Hopefully I see you on the mountain or see you on some waves.
Take care.